Last week, there was the United Nations General Assembly. Even when the President of the United States of America was insulting everybody, African leaders sat there. But when their fellow African head of state is talking, they are busy doing other things. Who cast us? Who bewitched us? These are the uncomfortable questions that we must ask here. We have been too nice to each other for too long. The net effect is that if you go into any African environment, if you go to any African school and you ask young men and women, do you want to leave Africa? 9 of them want to run away. That is why they are dying in the Mediterranean Sea. That is why they are dying off the coast of Senegal. That is why they are being humiliated at embassies. You go to the embassy of any Western country, in any African country, and you'll see the humiliation.
The United Nations General Assembly had barely ended when an uncomfortable truth echoed across Africa. While the President of the United States stood at that marble podium, insulting, lecturing, and belittling entire nations, African leaders sat still, silent, motionless. But when one of their own, a fellow African head of state, rose to speak, they looked away, checked their phones, and whispered among themselves. That's when Professor Patrick Lumumba, a man known for his unfiltered honesty, asked the question that pierced through the silence: who cursed us? Who bewitched us? It wasn't a question of superstition. It was a cry of pain, an autopsy of dignity. Because across the continent, millions of young Africans are still dying in the Mediterranean, still humiliated at foreign embassies, still convinced that salvation can only be found beyond their homeland. And yet in that same hall, Lumumba dared to say what few would. The day Nigeria wakes up is the day Africa wakes up. He wasn't mocking. He was mourning. Mourning, a sleeping giant rich in oil talent and courage, yet paralyzed by division and disbelief. In a world where small nations like Singapore thrive, how can Africa's largest democracy still crawl? This wasn't just another speech. It was a thunderclap, a warning that time is running out. Because if Nigeria does not lead, Africa will remain lost, and the dream of independence will rot into memory. So tonight, as you listen, ask yourself, what happens when the lion forgets he is a lion? And more importantly, who will remind him? Please share if you believe Africa deserves leaders who speak the truth, no matter the cost. Subscribe if you believe that the truth spoken boldly is more powerful than the headlines. It began with silence, the kind that carries centuries of unspoken pain. The hall was full, the lights bright, but every eye turned away as Professor Patrick Lumumba stood behind the podium. There was no teleprompter, no script, no empty diplomatic courtesy. Just truth, raw, uncomfortable, and long overdue. He looked around the room and asked again, this time, slower, heavier, who cursed us? Who bewitched us? The air thickened. The audience shifted uneasily, because deep down everyone knew what he meant. He wasn't talking about witchcraft or religion. He was talking about us, about the chains we forged with our own hands, the chains of self-doubt, imitation, and silence. Lumumba reminded the crowd of something they had all seen but chosen to forget: the humiliation of African youth dying in the Mediterranean Sea, trying to escape their own continent. 9 out of 10 young Africans, he said, would rather flee than stay. Not because Africa lacks potential, but because it lacks belief. Because in too many places, hopelessness has become policy. He painted a picture so vivid that no one could look away. Young men washing ashore in Senegal, mothers waiting outside Western embassies begging for visas that will never come, answering questions about ancestors who died before they were born. Then his voice grew stern. He turned toward the Nigerian elites seated before him, governors, ministers, businessmen in pressed suits. In the next 40 years, he said, many of you will be upstairs. What are you leaving behind for your children? That single question sliced through the room like lightning, because it wasn't just about Nigeria. It was about the soul of Africa. Lumumba called Nigeria the reluctant giant, powerful, blessed, and asleep. He listed what the world already knows: over 200 million citizens, vast oil reserves, brilliant doctors, engineers, and lawyers scattered across the globe. If you go anywhere in the world, he said, and you don't find a Nigerian run, there is nothing there. The crowd laughed nervously, but he didn't. He wasn't joking. He was pleading. Because when Nigeria decides to lead, Africa follows. He reminded them how Nigerian peacekeepers once saved Liberia and Gambia. But in recent years, the Sahel has burned while Nigeria hesitated. When Nigeria did not stand up, he said the problems were not stabilized. And then came the challenge that turned admiration into discomfort. Nigeria debates GDP with Egypt and South Africa, he said, but this is a debate between dwarfs arguing who is taller. Even if one stands higher, they are still dwarfs. A gasp rippled through the room, but Lumumba pressed on. He compared Nigeria's $500 billion GDP to Singapore's $564 billion, a nation smaller than Lagos and with only 6 million people. What does Nigeria not have, he demanded. Is the oil here different from the oil in Saudi Arabia or Qatar? Why must we remain paralyzed by analysis and lamentation? The words echoed like thunder. He quoted the great writer Chinua Achebe. The trouble with Nigeria, and by extension Africa, is simply and squarely one of leadership. Then he paused, looked across the hall, and said, leadership is not just politics. It is at every level in your schools, your businesses, your communities. For a moment, the crowd was silent again, but this time it was not from shame, it was reflection. Because everyone there knew he was right. The continent's pain was not a mystery. It was a mirror. Lumumba wasn't asking for miracles. He was asking for courage for Nigeria to remember who she is, to act not as a follower, but as a forerunner to awaken the lion that has slept too long. And somewhere between the applause and the discomfort, between the pride and the guilt, something began to stir, a quiet realization that Africa's awakening might truly begin. The day Nigeria stops hitting the snooze button on its destiny. As Lumumba's voice rose, so did the tension. His words were no longer gentle reminders, they became strikes of a hammer against a wall of complacency. He spoke with the urgency of a man who knew that if Africa did not wake now, it might never wake at all. You cannot keep running a nation like a club of tribes, he said, his hand slamming against the podium. In this very hall, you call each other brothers. But when it comes to running the nation suddenly, you speak of religion, of ethnicity, of region. Why? A murmur swept through the room. Some faces stiffened. Others nodded quietly, because every Nigerian in that hall understood the truth. Their greatest weakness was not poverty or lack of oil, but division. Lumumba leaned forward, his eyes sharp as fire. Why can't the same spirit of unity that runs this club, this small microcosm of success, be scaled up to run your nation? He paused, then delivered the line that would become one of his most quoted in years. In your clubs, you do not care who is who. But when you want to run the club that is Nigeria, you talk tribe and religion. Why? The crowd fell silent. The weight of his words pressed down like a storm. For the first time, the discomfort had become transformation. People were no longer defending themselves, they were listening. Lumumba's tone softened. You are the crème de la crème, he said, the best of Nigeria and therefore the best of Africa. But does Africa feel you? Does your excellence translate into leadership or only into comfort? The question lingered haunting, because in that moment the truth of Africa's elite stood naked brilliance without direction, potential without purpose. Then came the pivot, the moment the hall shifted from silence to resolve. Lumumba turned from criticism to challenge, from despair to construction. He spoke of education universities that dream of becoming Harvard and Cambridge instead of believing in their own greatness. He spoke of industry Nigeria, importing rice from Pakistan, chicken from Brazil, and palm oil from Malaysia, resources that should have been symbols of local strength. He spoke of electricity, calling it the simplest proof of leadership. There is not a single country in Africa, he said, where you can stay in a hotel for 1 hour without power going out. Electricity is not rocket science. Yet we are paralyzed. Who cursed us? The room laughed nervously again, but this time out of recognition, not mockery. Because every person there had lived through those blackouts. Every person had made excuses. Lumumba's voice then turned prophetic, echoing through generations. Potential is nothing if it is not realized. We must not continue to be victims of adversity. We must be conquerors of it. That was the turning point, the speech's spiritual climax. The applause began tentatively, then grew into a standing ovation. But Lumumba didn't smile. He wasn't there for applause. He raised his hand and continued. The independence of Ghana meant nothing without the freedom of the rest of Africa. And today, the liberation of Africa will mean nothing without the awakening of Nigeria. Every syllable landed like a drumbeat. You could feel the pride, the shame, and the hope intertwining the triple heartbeat of a continent in crisis. He ended that segment with a vision not of what Africa was, but what it could become. A Nigeria that no longer asks Africans for visas. A continent where trade, education, and air travel are open and shared. A people who no longer look to the West for validation, but to each other for renewal. And as he stepped back from the microphone, the hall erupted not in the polite applause of diplomats, but in the trembling ovation of people who had just seen themselves in the mirror. That night, something shifted, a consciousness, a memory, a seed. Because even the skeptics who had arrived to be entertained left with a question echoing in their chest. If Nigeria is the lion of Africa, when will it finally roar? The morning after Lumumba's speech, something felt different in Nigeria. It wasn't just the echo of applause fading through the hallways, it was the quiet hum of awakening. Clips of his words spread across social media like wildfire. Young Nigerians posted them with captions like, "He said what our leaders never dared to say." Across Lagos, Abuja, and Port Harcourt, radio hosts replayed his question, "Who bewitched us?" as if it were a national prayer. It wasn't merely a critique, it was an invitation, a call to rediscover dignity in a nation that had long been taught to doubt itself. In universities, students debated the meaning of reluctant leadership. Professors quoted Lumumba's comparison between Nigeria and Singapore, between the sleeping giant and the restless city-state that refused to accept smallness. On campus walls, someone painted in bold letters, "The day Nigeria wakes up, Africa wakes up." In the political arena, the reaction was more cautious, even defensive. Some government officials dismissed the speech as academic idealism. But privately, several governors and ministers admitted that Lumumba had said aloud what they whispered in corridors. He had exposed an uncomfortable truth: Nigeria's crisis was not a lack of wealth, but a lack of will. Within days, opinion columns and talk shows picked up his message. One commentator called it the sermon Nigeria didn't know it needed. Another wrote, "Lumumba didn't insult us, he reminded us." Even members of the ruling party, usually immune to moral confrontation, began invoking his words when discussing economic reform, power generation, and education. But the most powerful reaction came not from politicians, but from ordinary citizens. Teachers began using his quotes in classrooms. Entrepreneurs in Kano and Kaduna started campaigns promoting Made in Nigeria. A group of young engineers launched a hashtag No More Chicken Feed, referencing Lumumba's final metaphor: "We are eagles fed on chicken feed for too long." For a moment, the speech turned into a movement, an emotional spark that transcended the boundaries of politics. It connected to something ancient and buried the same fire that once burned in the hearts of men like Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, and Nelson Mandela. And yet, the establishment trembled. Because Lumumba's message didn't just challenge Nigeria, it challenged the entire post-colonial order. He had publicly dismantled the illusion that independence was enough, that freedom without vision could sustain a continent. In a time when Western powers still dictated Africa's financial systems and media narratives, his words sounded dangerously liberating. They echoed the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, a younger generation of leaders who refused to be managed, measured, or manipulated. For older Africans, Lumumba's words reopened a wound. For the youth, they became a roadmap. They began asking questions no longer whispered but shouted: "Why do we still import what we can create? Why do we still obey what we can question? And why do we still wait for the world to approve our progress?" By the end of the week, a Nigerian newspaper published an editorial titled, "From Lagos to Ouagadougou, Africa's Roar Has Begun." It described Lumumba's speech not as rhetoric, but as prophecy, one that only leaders with courage could fulfill. And beneath the headline, a single line stood out: "Perhaps the torch has passed from the professors to the soldiers, from the orators to the doers." Because somewhere in Ouagadougou, a young captain named Ibrahim Traoré had already begun turning those words into action. From Washington to Brussels, Lumumba's words did not go unnoticed. In fact, within 24 hours of the speech going viral across Africa, several Western media outlets quietly picked it up cautiously, almost reluctantly. CNN's Africa Bureau aired a short segment describing it as a bold call for introspection among African elites. The BBC, however, called it a nationalist revival speech, reminiscent of the 1960s Pan-African era. The tone was familiar, distant, analytical, and a little nervous. Because for the first time in a long while, Africa was not asking for aid, pity, or partnership. It was demanding respect. In diplomatic circles, Lumumba's words triggered quiet discomfort. At the U.S. State Department, an internal memo summarized the speech as symbolic of growing populist sentiment against Western influence in Africa. That memo would circulate among analysts who had already been watching with concern the rise of young leaders like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, Assimi Goïta in Mali, and Tiani in Niger, all men rejecting the old post-colonial contracts and replacing them with unapologetic sovereignty. To Washington's political veterans, especially those who remembered the Cold War, Lumumba's voice was both haunting and familiar. It carried the cadence of an Nkrumah's Ghana, the defiance of Thomas Sankara's Burkina Faso, and the intellectual sharpness of Malcolm X. He wasn't calling for violence. He was calling for dignity, something far more dangerous to any system built on dependency. Western think tanks began to spin it differently. One report in Foreign Policy magazine warned that anti-Western rhetoric in Nigeria could embolden populist movements across the continent. Another, from the Economist Intelligence Unit, described it as an ideological threat to Western soft power. But the irony was impossible to miss. Lumumba never once mentioned the West directly. He simply demanded that Africa stand up for itself, and that apparently was enough to make the powerful uneasy. In Europe, the reactions were mixed. French commentators viewed the speech through the lens of history, connecting it to the recent wave of military transitions in the Sahel. One Paris newspaper headlined, "From Words to Weapons, the Rise of the Pan-African Generation." Meanwhile, in Germany, political analysts saw in Lumumba's speech a philosophical alignment with Europe's own struggles for identity and economic autonomy. Across the Atlantic, many Americans, particularly African Americans, found in Lumumba's voice a familiar echo. Social media pages of Pan-African and diaspora groups lit up with discussions. They saw in his words the same spirit that fueled the civil rights movement, the same longing for equality and self-respect. In churches across Atlanta and Chicago, pastors quoted his lion and eagle metaphor in Sunday sermons, calling it a reminder that freedom must be guarded, not gifted. And yet perhaps the most powerful reaction came not from governments or journalists, but from ordinary viewers, men and women who saw in Africa's awakening a mirror of their own struggles. For many older Americans watching online, Lumumba's words stirred a question that transcended geography. Have we too become spectators in our own story? Because deep down they recognized something universal. When a people forget their worth, they invite their own chains. And when a nation, any nation, remembers who it is, the world must adjust to the sound of its roar. When the hall finally emptied that night, the echoes of Lumumba's voice lingered like a storm refusing to pass. He had not promised miracles, and he had not offered comfort. He had done something far rarer. He had held up a mirror to a sleeping giant and forced it to look at itself. Nigeria, he said, must remember who she is, and by extension, so must Africa. But here's the warning beneath the poetry. If Africa does not rise now, others will decide her future again, because power in this world never leaves a vacuum. When leaders trade courage for convenience, the void is filled by those who see opportunity in weakness. And history, as Lumumba reminded us, has no mercy for nations that forget their purpose. Across Africa, from Lagos to Ouagadougou, from Nairobi to Bamako, something is shifting. It's not just political, it's spiritual. A new generation is refusing to apologize for wanting control of their resources, their currencies, and their dignity. And if you listen closely, you'll notice something powerful. They are no longer asking for permission. That's what frightens the old world and what gives hope to the new. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso are already turning Lumumba's words into blueprints. They're building industries, reclaiming mines, banning plastic, planting trees, and daring to imagine a future written in their own languages. They are not waiting for the West to validate their dreams. They are validating them through action. For the older generation watching from afar, this may feel familiar, that same spark of self-belief that once defined post-war America, that belief that a nation can rebuild itself through sweat, sacrifice, and faith. And maybe that's why Lumumba's message resonates so deeply, because it isn't just about Africa. It's about every nation, every people who have forgotten that freedom is a discipline, not a gift. So tonight, as we close this story, let's remember his final metaphor. We are eagles who have eaten chicken feed for too long. We are lions who have tasted rats for too long. The time has come to remember the taste of antelopes. And perhaps the real question is not just for Africa, but for us all. Have we too forgotten what it means to fly? Please share if you believe that Africa's awakening is not just a continental story, but a human one. Subscribe if you believe that the truth spoken boldly is still the most powerful weapon we have.